Hello. Today I'm going to speak about the reading from John and the reading from Romans. Let us have a moment of prayer. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable unto you, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Now, both the readings today are about resurrection, but interestingly, also in both the readings, we have, on the one hand, quite strongly death, and on the other hand, we have life or resurrection. In John, as Roger has also beautifully explained, we have all the awful words around the death of Lazarus, and in Romans, we have all the time Paul talking about the flesh and the spirit. And the flesh leads to death, and the spirit leads to life. And all the time in that passage that we read, there is this backwards and forwards between death, flesh, and life, the spirit. Now, I have always felt a little bit sorry for Lazarus, because he had to die twice. And then if you read the reading, we have all the unexpected things in there. He's been dead for 4 days. Imagine having to wait 4 days. Or maybe Lazarus was out of time and he didn't notice, I don't know. But the stench. And then in the end, he is called the dead man. I always feel a little bit sorry for Lazarus. But I think that if we feel sorry for Lazarus, we haven't quite understood what the reading is really about. Now, one of the moments in the reading that might help us to understand what this is all about is in verse 33. So in verse 33, we find, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. Now, in the Greek, it doesn't really say greatly disturbed. That's a bit of a euphemism. It says he was angry. And the word that is used is a deep and very angry anger. It is snorting with anger, like very, very strong word for anger. Now, clearly our translators feel very uncomfortable to say that of Jesus, and have taken a bit of a wider interpretation in saying that he was greatly disturbed. But if we go back to the text and we think, what made Jesus so angry? Why was he so angry? What was brought up in him that had this huge anger raising up that ultimately comes into his shout, "Lazarus, come out!" which is almost more angry than a meek and kind of thing. And I wonder, when we are asking what is Jesus angry about in that story, in that text, that also raises the question, what is Jesus angry about now in our world? What really irks Jesus? Now, I wonder, reading the John reading, but also reading it together with Paul from Romans, whether what raises Jesus' anger is the grip that death has on our lives. Because a lot of our lives are lived in the grip of death. And that's exactly also what Paul is talking about when he's talking about the flesh and the spirit. And we shouldn't misunderstand flesh as being material and spirit as being somehow immaterial. No, both flesh and spirit can be bodily and and not bodily. I mean, flesh is as much not bodily, for example, in greed, as spirit is very much bodily, for example, as in the NHS, where the spirit of Jesus Christ, of his love and care for everybody, is worked out physically every day. Paul talking about death, flesh, and spirit is hard to understand. Let me read it to you in the translation of Peterson. Then it might become a bit clearer. Peterson interprets flesh as being obsessed with yourself, which is an interesting interpretation. Obsession with self in these matters is a dead end. Attention to God leads us out into the open, into a spacious, free life. Focusing on the self is the opposite of focusing on God. Anyone completely absorbed in self ignores God, ends up thinking more about self than about God. That person ignores who God is and what he is doing. So there we find some explanation of how you could interpret Paul's wanting to take us away out of that grip of death, that grip of being completely going into ourselves and therefore completely obsessed with our own life or the absence of it. And Paul is trying to explain that with faith in Jesus and living in the Spirit, that then we already share in the resurrection life of Spirit, without denying that our bodies will die. At the end of that reading, he says again in Peterson, it stands to reason, doesn't it, that if the alive and present God who raised Jesus from the dead moves into your life, he'll do the same thing in you that he did in Jesus, bringing you alive to himself. When God lives and breathes in you, and he does as surely as he did in Jesus, you are delivered from that dead life with his Spirit living in you, and in your body will be as alive as Christ's body is. Now, John says basically exactly the same, very beautifully, in his when he responds to Martha, and that is in verse. I now have to find that in verse 25, where Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and anyone who lives and believes in me will never die." Do you believe this? So, when Jesus is shouting out Lazarus out of that grave, that is not to give Lazarus immortality. That is to break the bondage that death has on our life. With the words of St. Paul in Corinthians, death, where is your sting? Now, I wonder what for us means the hope of the resurrection in our reality, here and now. I think the hope of the resurrection really changes everything. It takes away the panic, it takes away the fear, and it helps us to respond in an utterly different way to the situation we find ourselves in. One of the things that the crisis we lived through has done is it has made us more aware of our own death and of the death that we carry with us everywhere we go. It has only made us more aware of that. That was always, in a certain way, the case. Now, the hope of the resurrection as a reality in our life means that we don't have to be overwhelmed by that awareness. We don't have to be in the grip of it. We can be free. We can hold it lightly, if you will. The hope of the resurrection finds in every circumstance the opportunity to live out God's love and God's care. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Amen.